Hey everyone, welcome to today's edition of One Single Story, where each weekday we offer a brief lesson from a section of today's reading from the One Year Bible, and we examine some questions that extend our learning from the sermon on Sunday. Today I'm joined by Rivenbark and Alyssa Bream, and we're looking at a passage from Mark chapter 5, verses 1 through 20. So, Jay, you want to read part of this?
And I'll just say, as part of the intro here, this is where Jesus encountered the guy who was demon-possessed, got a lot of demons, cast him out, 2,000 pigs, run off the cliff into the water, and it's a big deal. Verse 15 tells us that a crowd soon gathered around Jesus, and they saw the man who had been possessed by the legion of demons. He was sitting there fully clothed and perfectly sane, and they were all afraid, which I find a unique part of that story. They apparently were afraid of him before he got delivered, and they're afraid of him after he's been delivered. Then we'll go to 18. As Jesus was getting in the boat, the man who had been demon-possessed begged to go with him. But Jesus said, "Nope, go home to your family and tell them everything the Lord has done for you and how merciful he has been." So the man started off to visit the 10 towns of that region and began to proclaim the great things Jesus had done for him. And everyone was amazed at what he told them. This story is, if you could see that unplayed, you'd be like, this is just so dramatic. So I'm curious, when you read or hear this story, what comes to your mind? What stands out significant about it?
I noticed something this time that I hadn't seen before. So this man seems to have had ongoing relationship with people. It's at least implied in the text, right? So he's demon possessed, but he meets all of the definitions of somebody who's emotionally, spiritually tortured to the point of insanity, right? He prefers to live in a graveyard. It's isolating. It's an antisocial act, right? He's performing acts of self-harm to himself because he cuts himself with stones, and he's described as howling like an animal. And that's more antisocial, unbalanced behavior. But at some point, somebody cared enough for him, or at least felt responsible to manage his situation. There was some type of relationship there. I hadn't noticed it or paid attention to it that way before, right? We don't know who it was, but somebody tried to restrain him. Somebody tried to put him in chains and shackles. And I was struck by the idea that somebody wanted to help him, right? At least that's the observation I'm going to make. They wanted to help him, but they felt powerless to do so. And I have been in those spots where I felt completely useless, maybe the right word. I wanted to help, but I just didn't know what to do, right? And there have probably been some times where I even took action that was worse, instead of better. There's also this implied relationship with the herdsmen and the members of the community. They probably saw him more as a danger or a problem. Most likely his condition didn't just affect himself, it affected other people. And what struck me about this implied relationship was they had trouble seeing him as a person, right? He's a problem to be solved. He's a danger to be controlled. They had dehumanized him, if you will.
But then we see Jesus step into the situation, and he fixes a lot of broken things in this man's life. He fixes his isolation, living in the graveyard all alone. He no longer has to do that. He helps the man's self-destructive habits. This torture that was going on inside of his mind was fixed and healed. The person, he'd been dehumanized, but then society was finally able to see him again as a human, not just as a problem. He healed his relationships. He was able to go back home to his family. And Jesus not only gives him self-control so he's not going to harm himself anymore, but he also gives him a purpose with that freedom. And like the scripture says, go home to your family and tell them everything the Lord has done for you and how merciful he has been.
Do you think people who manifest spiritual and emotional torture, usually in the forms of actions, that we would associate with mental health disorders like isolation, self-harm, antisocial, are typically viewed more as problems than they are as people?
I think oftentimes that is the case for a multitude of reasons. One, those individuals, as the man in our story, are difficult to deal with. We may be afraid of them, intimidated by them. We don't have the answer, just like these people didn't. And the things we have tried don't work. And therefore, I think avoidance becomes a tactic we use, whether it's intentional or unintentional. And so I would say, yeah, we do often view those people as a problem to be solved.
I think sometimes it's easier to use people's differences as their identifier, and that whatever the difference is becomes the thing that we use to identify them. And one of the things that I've seen on social media is that I've learned is you're supposed to use I wish I would have written down this word exactly, but like person first language. So if you're talking about someone that maybe has autism, instead of saying autistic person, saying person with autism. And I think that there's a subtle change there. And I am not at all saying that autism is brought about because of spiritual issues. But I think we have to remember first that that's a human there. And if we're not, sometimes simple things like language can make a big difference with how we view people.
It's such a foreign subject to many of us, and most of us feel unqualified, right?
Mm-hmm.
And how to say, and even, and I'm hearing you say a person with X instead of,
they
X
are
person, right?
Mm-hmm.
I hear that, right? But in the moment, changing that language and putting that into practice is very, very difficult. And I would say this is true of almost anything that we can't explain or don't know what to do with. We view more as a problem than we do as people. It doesn't really matter what it is. If they're some type of criminal, we see it more as a problem than we do as a person. And, I think that's a challenge. So can we expect Jesus to radically transform mental health disorders today? And there would be some people who would push back with me for talking about this being a mental health disorder. But do you believe Jesus can transform mental health disorders today?
The answer is yes. I would say both directly and indirectly. When you talk about mental health disorders, there would be such a long list of things that would go into a list. We probably have some preconceived ideas of what some of those things would be. And sometimes I'm convinced our relationship and walk with God, as it grows and develops and we mature and we spend time in the Word and pray, that we find help and deliverance through that. And then there are things that the transformation comes through counseling and professional help. But that's still a transformation, if somebody finds it that way. And I think it's one of the areas where the church has missed it sometimes, where our approach is we say things like, I'll be praying for you. We'll even share the prayer request, but sometimes people need expert help beyond that. And when we can partner people with those resources, then I think we help in that transformation. And if healing comes through that, then so be it.
If we believe that Jesus is still in the miracle working business, then I think we have to believe that there is at least the possibility that you can be radically healed. If we believe that Jesus can heal from all sorts of other diseases, he can heal this. I do think we talked earlier in the week about like things that are super obvious that people have going on. And I think mental health is one that is a lot more hidden. So it can be a lot more isolating. And I think the way that Jesus can help radically transform every single person with mental illness is having the freedom and the grace and the hope to confide in other people around you and not to let that be an isolating thing. We find freedom in the community. And so like whether that's a small group or some other Celebrate Recovery or some other place where you can find community, and that will do an amazing amount of healing in your life, even if you're still living with depression, anxiety, any of those things. It will still help you, and you won't feel so isolated, which I think is one of the worst parts of dealing with mental illness.
I think so many people become divided when you ask a question like this. So there are people who fall into a camp that, well, of course he can, and that's the only thing we should be doing is praying for people, right? And letting God set them free. And then there are other people who would be just as resistant to say, go see a medical professional, get counseling, take the medicine that you need. In the church world, we feel like the two can't coexist, especially about this issue. More, in my opinion, more than any other sickness, right? We are comfortable in the church praying for somebody who has cancer while they get radiation. But we struggle with things like mental illness, praying for people to be delivered, set free, healed, whatever the case may be. And while they get the help they need, whether they're taking medicine or whatever that is, it becomes in my opinion, an unnecessary debate. All mental illness is not created by demons or spiritual disorders. I'm going on record as saying that. So I'll take the heat if somebody listens and disagrees. It could be a chemical imbalance. It could be tragedy, trauma. There's so many other things that could have created that and caused that in their life. But it can also be 100% spiritual. Yes. Right? That's the other side of it. The discernment to get there to figure out what that is a challenge. So I know somebody right now that I believe, like I've said to the stakeholders, this is a spiritual issue, right? I believe it. Like I believe they need deliverance, but they will not participate in anything that remotely looks like that. Now, it's rare that I'm going to say that. It's rare that I'm going to have that strong an opinion about a situation. But I think we try. It's the only sickness, and most of it is because we can't understand it, right? Yeah. When somebody has a mental illness, we don't see how it's deteriorating their life, where we can see cancer or, anything else that might be. And so it becomes a real challenge where that's concerned. So we talk a lot about forgiving sin. And we've talked this week about restoring people back into society and into places. Is it just theory, or can we actually restore emotionally, mentally disturbed people who've had mental illnesses back into community? Can we do that? And how do we do that?
It is theory in that it's always a good thought process. The challenge is to actually assimilate people back into community, even on a church level, depending on the person, the type of mental illness, the degree, the length of it, and all those things I think factor in. I'm thinking through a couple of folks that are going through my mind that have struggled at different levels of mental illness. And they found a safe place in a smaller group, smaller setting with people that had the level of love and compassion, patience with them, where a larger group setting wasn't necessarily the best fit for them. So they can, whether or not we do a good job that or not would be a different question. I think it's awkward for us to try to figure out that fit and that assimilation sometimes, just as awkward as it is on the front end to recognize it, define it, help find a solution to it. It's a complicated issue.
I feel like it's such an individualized thing. Like Jesus is in the business of restoring relationships and lives and all of that. So I think it is definitely possible, but there are so many variables with if somebody maybe has been depressed and hasn't come to church for a year, bringing them back in is like a joyous thing. Like this person finally has broken free of, the depression that has caused them to isolate themselves and things like that. And as we get into different things, I think we have to maybe deal with things maybe more carefully to make sure that we're not causing harm to that person. There's a lot of things to balance, and it's such an individual thing to restore the people. Like if they've caused harm to people in the church with the whatever sort of things were going on, is that the best place for them to be in that same situation? Is it better for them to go to a fresh community, be honest about it, but there's not people who are actually hurt by that?
Yeah, that didn't have the model I think that is Jesus gives that I think is probably wise is he says, go back home, tell your family, right? If you can see the familial relationships be restored and the family goes, okay.
And that's a good starting point.
Then this is good.
Yeah.
Then you feel like, okay, this person can be trusted in other relationships. But if they can't go back and resolve those family relationships, then I think you have to be careful at least where you place them, because there may be reasons why the family has their
Well, absolutely. And there's a verse 16 in that passage that I think is significant in this discussion. After Jesus delivered this guy and he told the people what happened and why he's transformed, they got uncomfortable with Jesus and asked him to leave, to go away from them. And I think part of the reason we struggle is it was understanding and identity, resources, all those things. But when we identify with those troubled people, we often get labeled with them and people get uncomfortable with us.
I can remember as a kid thinking this. There was a man in the church and he would have seizures. And they had given him this medicine. I don't know what was going on, what the cause of the seizures were. There was medicine going on he was taking. But, and when I say seizures, I certainly don't want to make fun of what was happening, but I can remember as a kid, more than one time he'd have a seizure in the choir. At least that's what everybody attributed. And he would just start rubbing all of his hands all over people, in the choir. And he he took medicine that, literally on their face.
Seizure,
Wow. And he'd be licking his face, it was weird. They gave him medicine to be able to control it, right? And as long as he took the medicine, he didn't. And I remember they said, he's going to stop taking the medicine. We're claiming healing. And then, like 3 weeks later, he has a seizure in the choir, in the middle of service, and it just disrupted for everybody. And I remember, I'm probably 8, 9, 10, 11, young, and I remember thinking, take your medicine.
Yeah.
Right? Just take your medicine. Because it can be disruptive and we don't know how to respond. We don't know what to do. And it can make us uncomfortable. Their actions and even the deliverance of it, because if that's a spiritual issue, right? If somebody's possessed, they're going to be a different person, right? How do you respond to this person, right? This ain't even the same person I knew. Well, thank you for joining us today on this edition of One Single Story. We hope you'll be back with us tomorrow as we continue a conversation around our daily Bible reading from the One Year Bible.